transcendence over the branch of
Okay,
EP.
so I guess to rephrase, we'll each present a single argument, call it,
Yeah, main argument.
and then we can do some back and forth and challenging following that. But I think we should each have. I don't have like a set time that I think is reasonable. Let's just not be absurd
Okay, so
with it.
suppose scans, obviously, you can request scans and sources and all that stuff, so that
Yes.
should be fine.
Yeah,
So should we
I've got.
begin, or do you want to first get definitions in place?
Let's start with definitions, and I guess just real quick though, before we even get to that, do we have multiple judges? Are Snow and Fanta both judging, or is it just Fanta now and Snow is just kind of spectating?
Yeah,
Or
quite frankly, I'm quite confused on that as well. I'm not too sure who exactly is judging, so we'll have to just ask them, I suppose. I'll just ask
let's do
them
the
to
Fanta
themselves.
Snow. Who's judging? Who's spectating? They're both in VC, so they can both hear us.
Yeah, I think it's Fanta and Snow. I'm pretty sure that's it.
I mean, oh, there's a. Oh, I see the scans channel.
Yeah,
That'll
we'll
make it.
be placing sources and all that stuff, so just to make sure there's no fabrications or anything like that. Okay, so Fanta and Snow judging, you go with that?
Hold on. Both of them, or
Yeah, both of them.
that's fine.
Okay.
Particularly have a problem with that. Okay, so we got
now that we've
that
judged
out of the way.
let's get to
Then,
definitions. How do you define EP?
okay, I will actually let me just post it in chat so it's in text form too. It is right where why I never find the thing when I looking for them. Here it is. Okay, there it is. Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I don't think we want to go over a 2-hour period anyway. Okay. I just dropped it in. I can actually move that. Would you rather I move that to scans now that I think about it? Or the other side?
Yeah, probably. That'll make it more streamlined, you know?
Just, really, it's not a scan, but part of it. So anything debate related will just be in the scans channel for anyone following in VC.
Yeah, this looks fine, honestly. But can I ask, what do you mean by perceive emotions? So the ability to perceive emotions in others. You just mean to identify them?
I mean, yeah. To perceive emotions, I guess a more broad statement, but the ability to either identify emotions or emotional reactions or like a emotional state, anything like that would fall under perceive emotions. But really, the only thing that is critical to EP, but to critical to making a feat actually emotional perception under like an emotional intelligence model is it needs to be through identifiable different variables, I guess.
Okay, so I'll
It
just
can't like basically like intuition wouldn't be EP, even if you were 100% correct with identifying the emotions. Doing it via intuition is just inherently different from EP.
okay,
Not a
so
form of
why would you say that, let's say, you looked at a facial expression, right? So we can usually use the example of a psychopath because generally psychopaths have a more intuitive understanding of others rather than a very conscious understanding. So
Yeah.
if we had a psychopath, right, and they could identify an emotion through a picture of a face of, let's say, someone making an expression, or through meeting someone and seeing their expression or tone of voice and all these things, why would it then not be emotional perception?
So that's where would kind of depend on whether it's emotional perception or not. Are you talking about like an actual photograph of a person?
Yeah, yeah. So if you had like usually in these tests they actually have someone making some sort of expression and then you try to
Yeah, like
label the emotion
that
they're
could
feeling. Yeah.
from a photograph could be emotional perception. Yes. Like you see pictures is in the definition there.
Yes, but what if you were identifying it intuitively? So instead of saying, "Oh, well, if I look at your face, right," and I say, "Well, you have tears in your
If you're
eyes,"
doing it intuitively, then
perhaps
you're
there are
not
other inserted.
using a photograph, you're doing it intuitively. What do you
Wait. How are you defining intuitively? I just have to clarify this real quick.
define intuitively? As in
Yes, when you say
without
intuitively.
the use of objective or logical cues, I guess. So
Okay, so
intuitively, like
if I look at a
if you are
photograph,
looking at a picture of someone's face, you are identifying expressions in their face and you are using that to connect to an emotional state. That is EP.
okay, no, but what I'm saying is if you look at the picture of someone's face, right, and let's say they have a sad expression, but you don't go through the actual process of, oh, well, their eyes look like this, or oh, they have a sad expression. You just look at the photo and understand it. Just intuitively, you look at the photo and you immediately understand what they are feeling. And that would still be intuitive, but you're also identifying emotions from a photograph.
Okay, I see what you're saying is the difference. I suppose that probably would still qualify as EP because how do I put this? I mean, I guess if you're meeting the standards, which are essentially being, I guess, as long as you're still going through the point of because EP is like an actual process in the sense of identifying emotions from these specific cues.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
because even if you're doing it, you know, quote unquote, intuitively, you're not doing it without the process of logic. Even if you're not
Exactly.
thinking through, oh, you know, their eyes are drooping, so that means they're sad. Even if you just understand that without having to think through the individual steps, there's still a logical process in there which identifies it as EP. It's
Yeah, here,
when
I'll send
you
my
it's
definition in scans if we can just try
it's
to distill the two.
yeah. So the difference, and we discussed this briefly in DMs, but the difference and really the issue, I mean, really the only issue that I have, actually, take that back. The first thing is we need to clarify the difference between EP in like the EQ model versus the EI model. And
Okay, so what model do you use?
I use the EI model, the ability model.
And what model is that? Like, what sources, who established that model in the first place?
I don't know that off the top of my head. I could,
Yeah, so I
sure,
use
but
a mix of the four branch and basically just the general understanding I have of emotional intelligence. So I honestly get quite confused because they never actually call it EQ, only ever EI, though it is a four model branch. So it doesn't have EF and ER, but those are involved within EP and EU, all that
yeah,
stuff.
I make that distinction because under the ability model, the ability to identify emotions in yourself is a different subset. That's what ER is. EP is specifically perceiving
The
emotions
ability
in
model, I
others.
used the four branch model. Is that in the EI model, as you call it? Is that what that is?
Yes.
All right, yeah. Obviously, I think we have a disagreement then on the models because I'm using the four branch by Solovi and Mayer. So I can send scans for that if you'd like. I can send.
I'm familiar with the model. I'm familiar with the four branch, but
So is there a reason you have a motivation for accepting the EI model is better or, alternative?
I could actually give me 2 seconds here. I can find the thing. But the main reason why I use it is because I find it more comprehensive in the six branch approach via versus the four because it covers the full range of interpersonal and intrapersonal, where the four branch does not cover that. So I
Mhm.
generally have just switched to it probably 8 months ago because
So how
it
does
was
it
more.
cover intrapersonal and interpersonal while the four branch model does not? How does that follow?
Okay, let me just do this. Make it give a visual example here. Easier to see. So these are the 6 branches of what I'll call the EI model.
And
Where
is this hierarchical?
no, this is not in any particular order.
Okay, then
It's
I would actually argue that the 4-branch model is far more comprehensive because it's not only hierarchical, but it also does cover all these. They're just not separated into different branches.
okay. So getting into a debate between a 6-branch and a 4-branch model is not actually the purpose of why we're here. So let's go ahead and take a step back and just we're already in.
Well, obviously it's not, but I think we kind of have to establish
Yeah,
the
but we
model we're going to
don't. We only,
use
as
before
long
it
as we
begins, no?
can establish what EP is, we're fine. We don't need to establish what the whole
Okay,
model
then do you
purpose.
agree with what I sent?
I don't. So no, but that's mainly because I said before. One, I don't qualify identifying emotions in yourself as under EP. I qualify that as under a different subcategory, which is ER. But
Okay,
the bigger,
so
but even just set that aside for a moment because that won't matter for the feat that I'm going to present because the feat I'm
no,
going to
exact same
present.
here, but the only reason I'm actually establishing this definition is because my argument is just going to be overall perfect EP. So in your model, that'd be EP and ER. It applies to both, so it really doesn't matter as long as you would grant the
That if
methodology
in
to
that
grant
case, then
EP.
sure, that's not the problem. But the issue I would have is the idea of abstract objects and art because that just entirely breaks what EP is. So that's like
Okay,
completely
so
not
how does
EP.
that break it? How does that break what EP
Okay,
is?
so the main issue is, as we kind of agreed earlier, EP is about observing specific cues and using those cues to determine emotion. Looking at abstract art or just abstract objects or art, none of those cues are present. All you're doing is interpreting the art, which is a completely different subset of not even intelligence. It's just, literary analysis or art analysis. It's an entirely different branch. It's not even emotional intelligence.
Okay,
You could
so
look at
I'd
a
like
piece of
to.
you could look at a piece of art and interpret that the art is presenting a theme of sadness or joy or whatever, but none of that will give you any ability to EP the artist because just because the artist paints something that shows sadness in their art doesn't mean the artist is feeling sad. There's a
Okay,
disconnect there.
so I would first like
It's just
to.
not
Okay,
logically possible to EP through an abstract object. So none of that is valid
yeah,
in the
two
definition.
things. So first, you say that you couldn't identify the artist, but is it actually ever stated that you would be identifying the person who made the art rather than what the art may represent? That not be another thing. So, for example, if the art is a very abstract,
You
like
you
let's
just
say
you
it's
just said the same
a caveman
thing.
in a cave.
You just
What?
said you you already confused me. You said I'm saying the artist. You're classifying that it's not the artist; it's the person who made the art, but that is the artist.
No, I'm
No.
saying the abstract, like the object itself. So, for example, if the artist drew a caveman in a cave, and the caveman is just stuck in this cave for the whole story, then you could possibly say the emotion that is being portrayed in the art is the fear of the unknown of leaving the cave, right? But that wouldn't actually mean
Oh,
you're trying to EV the
you're
artist.
talking
You're
about
assigning
EPing an
emotion.
element of the art. Oh no, that's completely impossible. That's not EP at
Yeah.
all.
So you'd agree with that?
No, I completely disagree with that. That is, you cannot EP an element of art because you can EP it's about human emotional intelligence, not art emotional intelligence. Art doesn't have emotional intelligence. So that entire example you gave would not be EP.
Okay.
Just
So what is your
just
reasoning for that? What is your reasoning for
I
that?
just told you my reasoning. If what you would have to be able to do to EP is look at the abstract art and just look, let's use the caveman example. You'd have to be able to look at that and identify a current, like what is that caveman feeling right now? which you could already see logically breaks the question because the caveman doesn't feel anything right now because it's a thing. It's an art. It's a picture. Pictures don't feel things. Pictures are
Right, so
objects. You can't
pictures don't
EP.
feel anything, right?
Yeah, so you can't EP a picture just flatly. That's if you believe you can, then
Okay,
your
then why
idea
were
of
we
what EP
totally
is
granting the fact that you
just
could
wrong.
perceive
Like,
emotion through a picture?
no, you can't. You can only thing you can pick up through art is an idea potentially that an author or an artist is conveying through their art. But again, you can't even then use that to go back and EP the artist because again, you're talking about a subjective form of analysis, which is art analysis. Two
Okay, so
people can analyze art and come to very different conclusions on how that art made them feel. That's no
okay, so
longer
obviously that's
EP.
true, but that doesn't actually mean anything. Just coming to
Yeah,
some
but it does in this
different
case because
interpretations.
EP is a fundamentally objective form of analysis because you are looking at specific objective cues that are identifiable and then relating those to emotional responses that portray those cues. That's the whole point of EP. When you don't have that, you don't have EP. What you're talking about is just a completely different subset of
Okay, so I
function.
need to kind of set this all down because you kind of just kept talking. But first, you said that you can't identify emotions in a picture, right? But earlier, when we were talking about intuitive identification, you granted the fact that you could identify emotions through a picture,
Okay,
for
so
example,
I'm going to go ahead and
through
stop you right
intuition.
there because you've already created a false dichotomy. And I have to go ahead and stop you before you go on that. What I granted was not I'm talking about a photograph of a person and identifying emotional cues in a photograph of that person that they are expressing in the photograph. This is a completely different thing than what you are now trying to connect it to, which is art. If you were talking about a actual photograph, which is a, call it photorealistic representation of this person that showcases all these cues, then yes, you can still identify different facial expressions and structures, or there's like a full body picture. You could look at body language, facial expression, whatever, and identify that. Obviously, things like voices, tone, whatever, are not going to be possible in a photograph. Now you're trying to say that I agree that's the same as art, which is just wrong. You're talking about an art where you're talking about a character in like a painting that's not a real person, that's not a photograph of a real person. That's where you've created a disconnect. So that's where I did not agree to that. I
To
agreed to
clarify,
something
your
completely different.
standard for identifying emotions within a picture, it has to be a real person. Is
It has to be
that correct?
a real representation, at least.
Okay, so what do you mean by real representation?
I don't think I can make it much clearer than I just did. This is the difference
Okay, so
between
you
like
mean the
a
cues have
painting.
to
There's a difference between
logically
a
follow you?
painting and a photograph here.
Yes, one is painted, one is not. But I'm asking, what is the standard for EP if you're only really saying that, oh, well, one is a realistic interpretation when you've only really defined that as it being a person. So I'm asking, does that mean that the cues for an emotion follow from, the face?
There's a vast majority of them, yes.
Okay, so what is your standard, though? What is your standard
My,
other than it being a person?
yes, I'm restating this. So to be able to something that can be EP. Again, EP is a study of human emotional intelligence. So if you are not looking at objective factors of a human, it can't be EP'd. A photo of a human is just about as close as you can get to not looking face to face at that person who's standing right next to you, which is why it's still possible to perceive some cues from a photograph. Again, they'd have to be visually accessible cues, things, facial expressions, body language, etc. You lose out on things like tone or, the sound of their voice, other cues that you could get that you can't get from a photograph. Now you lose the entirety of your cues when you're looking at, some form of abstract representation of the person, like a painting or art or anything like that. Now that we're not looking at, an objective one-to-one representation of them, there are now no more cues for you to identify in the course of EP. Now, what you are trying to claim from the sound of it is that if you're looking at some kind of art, you can still draw conclusions about that person. And what I see your point is that you can look at this, call it a painting of a person, and still pick up on, call it emotional cues of them. However, what you're doing is no longer EP, is the point. What you're doing is interpretation. Interpretation of art generally, but just some form of interpretation. And the whole point of EP is once you are interpreting something non-objective, it's just no longer EP as a whole. And even if some form of what is legitimate EP involves some form of interpretation, that would significantly weaken the EP as a whole, because now you're making non-logical steps.
So two things. One, so if you had a picture of a person, let's say they're crying, right? That's what you're trying to identify. And then this was repainted, where they have the same expression, same tear, everything. It's just now painted. Could you EP this painting?
No.
No.
Not unless the painting was like fundamentally an exact, undistinguishable replica of a photograph.
Okay, so your standard would then be... photograph.
Because if you are now replicating the painting, what you're doing is you are now trying to replicate something that is like a photograph is an inherently objective retelling. I'm by no means an expert on the science of how photography works, but in a general sense, you're taking light and reflecting it to get an accurate one-to-one representation of some frame. Like, it's not changing anything. It's not altering anything. It's not interpreting anything, is the point. It's just an objective one-to-one of what, some scenery, some image is.
Okay, so
painting is inherently not that.
Okay, so first you said...
No matter how precise and how talented you are as an artist, you can paint photorealistic art, but it's not a photo. It's still your rendering of something. Now it has changed. Now there is a disconnect. You are not actually identifying cues of that person. You are interpreting the cues of the art. That's where it breaks.
Okay, so once again, this is basically just presupposing that there's some objectivity to someone expressing an emotion, right? But in most of these pictures, they are interpreting what he would look like, for example, if you're sad, and then trying to recreate that through, let's say,
no, okay,
a tear and a furrow of the brow.
You're flipping. No. I'm not saying there's necessarily an objective cue of you will look sad if you're doing this, or if you're doing this, you are happy. No. The point of EP is there are objective identifiable factors, like your eyes are drooping, or your posture is slouched, or your tone of voice sounds higher pitched, or these are the objective factors, things that you can actually identify. That's what objective factor means. It doesn't mean that if you are slouching...
if we have a person in a painting with droopy fat... Oh my gosh, man.
You're going back to that. You're not listening to me. You're not listening.
No, Huntsman, you're not giving an actual standard other than...
It is as simple as this. What you are trying to claim is looking at a painting of a person representing these factors is the same as looking at a person doing these things and connecting that art to a person. That is wrong.
Okay, so if we're just going to go in circles and just halt this entire discussion, why don't you just send an actual source for it being not EP if you look at a artistic representation of what an emotion would look like?
Do you have...
Otherwise, we're just going to ramble. And yes, I do have sources if you...
A source that says looking at art is connectable EP to a person?
No, it talks about the identification of, just any sort of reconstructed idea of what an emotion is through art or imagery or anything like that. So if you have an actor...
That's what I'm saying is a separate thing, though. So you're not actually disagreeing with me then. No, show me your source and I'll point out, because the way you're describing your source sounds like you're not actually disagreeing with me. Send your source. Let's look at this, because So I'm saying I don't think you're actually listening or understanding the difference I'm trying to make. It does not sound like you're actually saying something different. It sounds like you think you're saying something different. We may not actually be disagreeing right now. Glad you're enjoying this, Fanta.
All right, check scans. You can go to pages 8, 15, 61, and 214.
All right, it opened to page 8. So okay, so that's page 8. You said 16.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's actually bookmarked.
Oh, no, 15, 15.
15. So far, nothing in here disagrees with what I'm saying. So that I don't think you're actually disagreeing with what I'm saying. I just don't think you are quite picking up what I'm saying. Like page 8 is talking about identifying facial expressions, which is what I said initially, which you agreed with.
No,
Where
no,
it's
no, no,
talking
no. That's
about
not what I'm
using
referring
no.
to.
You're talking about the part where it's talking about using pictures, right?
No, 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 no. Bottom of page 8, and then it
Yeah.
says the next chapter explains a number of potential problems encountered in understanding facial expressions, right? And so what it is saying is that EP, right, does not refer to the actual identification being actual perfect. It's understanding that cues can be tracked to then reach a conclusion on emotions felt. And so what I'm saying is if art can capture, even if not perfectly, an emotion, then you can still make a inference based on how those emotions generally in your experience would portray a certain emotion, and then say that painting or any sort of art piece is portraying a certain emotion. And then the accuracy at which you can do this would then entail how good the EP is, but we're just trying to see what actually makes it EP at all, right? So basically, I'm saying that if you can fairly reason some sort of emotional, feeling or state from cues, no matter how accurate these cues are, then it is EP. How bad this EP is depends on how well it actually follows from what you have perceived.
That's what you're trying to say. Okay. So that is where the disconnect is. You sure that was at the bottom of page 8? I don't see that's at the bottom of page 8.
Here, I'll send a scan for it. Hold on.
Okay, so looking at this specific scan you just sent, which I don't see at the bottom of page 8, but not the point. Firstly, I, in reading this, don't see anything that you're trying to connect two things here that aren't connected. So what this is saying is it's talking about, which you started to allude to, is the complexities in identifying specific, recognizable, what it calls recognizable differences in like a facial expression. And you're saying because there's not a perfect one-to-one of identifying, some facial expression, you can then, because it doesn't have to be one-to-one, look at art and get that. But the leap in logic that you're making is now what you're identifying is not these, recognizable features of a person. You are recognizing these features in an interpretation of the person. So it's now inherently different one way or another.
Okay, I have a question. Could you say that distress is an emotion or a mental state?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so would crying be a cue for distress?
Potentially.
Okay, so if an image of someone, an actor, fake crying, right, and an art piece of that same actor, or just a representation of what it would look like to cry, could you then say from both that they could be distressed?
Okay. So going
Preferably
back,
yes or no.
because you're trying to, so they want us to move on, so I'm going to make this very quick. And then
Yeah, we have been yapping. Geez, it's been like 30 minutes.
yeah. The issue is looking at either one doesn't give you any necessarily accurate information on what that person is actually. That's the inherent downfall of you photograph. But for putting that even aside a second, like you brought up the idea of like fake crying. So even if you can tell it's fake, or even if you can't tell it's fake, then you add the fact that it's the actor, like this person's not actually distressed. So these are just more disconnects. Plus, looking at the art wouldn't tell you anything about. You could tell this character in this instance looks distressed, but it tells you nothing about the actor. That's again these disconnects that are created upon looking at photographs, but then it completely breaks when you then look at art. Which is why I have, at the very least, issue with calling that EP, and kind of at the other end of that, think it should be dismissed as being like all EP altogether if that's what you're relying on for it. But
Yeah, so I guess I'll just, kind of clarify this and then we can just, I guess, move on to the feeds. I think we are kind of getting stuck up on this, but basically, I didn't just introduce the actor thing. I said that a long while ago where I said generally in these images and like, for example, the tests that Marin Salovi would then utilize to test someone's emotional intelligence, they're usually actors trying to portray an emotion and then you identify the cues they're portraying and then say, yeah, I'm pretty sure they are blank, right?
yeah,
So,
and that's the whole point, because that's part of how you study
yeah, and the
emotional
reason I
intelligence.
said
Just
this,
because you're trying to find a way to replicate something that you can then identify in what you call a real world scenario. So like
exactly.
that's all that is. That's not saying that you can functionally EP art to a person. That's just trying to replicate what approximately cues representing this emotion would look like in a person.
Well, yes, and then that would then be EP. That's basically the point. Because actually, earlier on, right, when I said this, basically none of your arguments actually hindered on the fact that it was a genuine emotion that they felt. So the same way an art piece,
No,
let's say the caveman.
it doesn't. No, that's fair. It doesn't have to be a genuine emotion in that sense, because EP, part of EP could be determining whether it's a genuine emotion based on specificity of cues, but no, it doesn't have to be. You're right on that.
Yeah, so if it's not actually hindering on the fact that it is a genuine emotion, then the same way the caveman that's a drawing can't actually feel any emotion as it's, just a drawing, an actor isn't feeling what they portray, but you can still, it's used within the model, so you'd have to be disagreeing with the model. It is still used as a test for EP because you are trying to identify the cues that are generally associated with an emotion
Okay,
and
so
then infer some
that's where
emotion.
I think now you're saying something different than you said initially. If in the caveman example, if what you're doing is saying they're crying, crying is an indicator for sadness. If that's the connection you're making, then that falls within the model. If you then try and take it the step forward to say that caveman feels sad, which I identified based on the crying, that's where it can't be true. That's where it logically breaks because the caveman's not actually feeling anything logically.
Okay,
When you
yeah, I know
when
they're
you
not
try to
actually
extend it
feeling
out that
anything.
second step, that's the issue I have with it.
Well, yeah, once again, I know they're not feeling anything the same way as in these tests. They obviously know the actor isn't sad because they are crying for a test. What you're saying is that you're trying to
Well, but
infer,
that's
assuming
different
they
because
felt
the
it.
person identifying it wouldn't necessarily know. I don't know if they know it's actors, but if you're actually looking at a person, that's where they could be feeling sad.
Okay,
This is a actual
so
person who can feel things.
Huntsman, please let me finish one thing, man.
Okay, go.
Okay, so once again, I don't really think them knowing if it's an actor really changes anything because you were just trying to infer an emotional state from what you can identify through cues, right? So it doesn't really matter whether it's genuine or true or whether the caveman or actor feels what they're feeling because your job isn't to identify objectively what they're feeling. You're probably never going to be able to get all these minute details of what someone is feeling just from a cue. You're trying your best to find what that is portraying through crying or through having a scrunched brow or any of these things. You're just doing your best to identify what is being portrayed. And that also works with people with, for example, nonverbal cues that people give off, or even like a baby, for example. They cry because they want attention, because they need things and they can't do anything themselves. Well, obviously, you can basically then say, oh, well, you really understand the baby. Well, it doesn't really matter because the baby is trying to give off a cue that they assume you would then associate with someone of distress that needs something, and then you give attention to it, and boom. So, yeah, basically all emotions, I would actually argue, are just interpretations of what someone expects to see, and then it is obviously you're going to use those cues so people then expect that of you. But if we really don't have any major disagreements, I think we should just move on and try to get to the actual substance of the argument because we've been having like a meta debate for like about an hour now. I'm
Yeah,
actually gonna have to go do my
yeah,
chores soon.
that was. I kind of was worried something like that would happen. That's why I said in DMs we might try and hash some of this out ahead of time, but I didn't quite think it would take this long. So,
Same,
yeah,
honestly.
I think that we should try and wrap this and move on to the actual, meat of
Okay, so I guess we can just do a really quick cross-contamination on this definition. So, do you think that you can make any sort of inference on what a art piece may feel? Obviously, this is within the context of it being art. So, could you make any inference based on the cues that is being portrayed?
In the way you described it, I would say yes. You can still identify the same kinds of cues that you would see in just a normal human and recognize that these are cues that would represent sadness or joy or whatever. You can still make the same kinds of cues as long as you're then not taking those cues and associating them with a real person to saying, because I identified these cues in art, I can then associate it with a real person or something
Exactly. We're
outside
just
of
talking
that.
about the ability to identify any sort of cues that may then, lead to an emotion or a
Be
mental
be
state.
present in something like that. Sure, yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. I
Okay, then
think
I
the
don't even think we have
disconnect.
any fundamental disagreements on our actual definitions.
Okay, that's
And
wonderful.
I'm not even going to make an argument that you want to actually identify some sort of art piece, obviously. So it's not even really a problem. I just wanted to get that out of the way. So when we actually
Then
get to
why
the
do we
debate,
then
it'll
why
be
do
like,
we need
sure.
this meta debate? I don't
Yeah.
know, but okay. See, Snow was on top of this earlier.
All right,
Does
yeah. So
does EP
Fanta,
of
do you have
art
all that
pertain to any
recorded?
of your feats?
Fanta, you have all
What?
that recorded? I have to go do my chores, but I'll be back on in about 20, 30. And
I
then we can
assume.
actually get to the feats, but I just have to go do my chores real quick. So, all
Okay, Fanta says yes. Okay, so
right. I'll be back, Huntsman. Ciao.
I'll be around. Just ping me when you're back.
you.